Dying elderly man is ready to say goodbye when a deer does the most incredible thing. Mr. Thomas had been struggling with terminal illness for many years. Although once an avid hunter, he changed his ways and began photographing wildlife instead of killing it. During his final days, Mr. Thomas had an astounding encounter with a beautiful deer, a large buck, and what happened between the two will blow your mind. Mr. Thomas had always been a man of simple pleasures, finding joy in the solitude and challenge of deer hunting. The annual ritual of obtaining his hunting license and setting out into the wilderness in search of the biggest bucks had been a significant part of his life for many years. However, life as it often does presented a shift in perspective that would change the course of his passions and pursuits. It was during a routine checkup that Mr. Thomas received news that would alter his outlook on life forever. Sitting in the sterile, silent office of Dr. Andrews, he felt a sense of unease that he couldn't shake off. "Mr. Thomas," Dr. Andrews began, his voice carrying a weight that immediately set Mr. Thomas on edge. "I'm afraid that tests have come back and the test results are not what we hoped." Mr. Thomas felt a chill run down his spine. "What is it, doctor? How bad?" "You've been diagnosed with a terminal illness," Dr. Andrews sighed. "With treatment, we're looking at a prognosis of up to 10 years. I'm so sorry." The room seemed to spin around Mr. Thomas as he processed the information. 10 years. The finality of it was both a shock and a strange sort of relief. At least now he knew. "Thank you, doctor. I need some time to process this," Mr. Thomas managed to say, his voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Returning home, the weight of his diagnosis heavy on his shoulders, Mr. Thomas knew he had to share the news with his daughter Latricia. She was not just his child, but his confidant, his support. Latricia could sense something was amiss the moment her father walked through the door. The usual light in his eyes seemed dimmed, replaced by a somber seriousness that immediately filled her with dread. "Dad, what's wrong?" Latricia asked, her voice tinged with worry. Mr. Thomas took a deep breath, the words he'd rehearsed on the way home suddenly sticking in his throat. "Latricia, I've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. The doctors say I have at most 10 years left." The news hit Latricia like a physical blow, her mind reeling as she tried to grasp the reality of her father's words. 10 years? But that's not enough time," she stammered, tears welling up in her eyes. "I know, sweetheart, I know," Mr. Thomas said, pulling her into a hug. "But it's the time I have, and I want to make the most of it. I've been doing a lot of thinking about life, what's really important." Latricia looked up at her father, noticing a resolve in his gaze that she hadn't seen before. "What do you mean, Dad?" Mr. Thomas smiled, a hint of his old self shining through the somberness. "I've decided to trade my rifle for a camera. I've spent so much of my life taking from nature, hunting and tracking, but now I want to give back. I want to capture its beauty, to preserve it in a way that respects the preciousness of life." Latricia, though still grappling with the news of her father's illness, couldn't help but feel a swell of pride. "That's beautiful, Dad. I think it's a wonderful idea." And so Mr. Thomas embarked on his new journey with a camera in hand. The woods, once a place of conquest, became his sanctuary, a place of peace and reflection. He would spend hours, sometimes entire days, quietly waiting for the perfect shot, the perfect moment that encapsulated the beauty and majesty of the wildlife he once hunted. His photographs, stunning in their clarity and depth, began to gain recognition. Local galleries expressed interest in displaying his work, and nature magazines reached out for permission to feature his images. Mr. Thomas, however, remained humble, finding the greatest reward in the act of capturing these moments rather than the accolades they brought. Despite the progression of his illness, Mr. Thomas never wavered in his commitment to his new passion. Latricia watched in awe as her father, even on his weakest days, would muster the strength to venture into the woods, camera in tow. It was as if the act of photographing the wildlife, of being a silent observer to their existence, gave him a vitality that transcended his physical limitations. Year after year, Mr. Thomas's collection of photographs grew, each image a sign of the beauty of life in its most unguarded moments. Deer drinking from a stream at dawn, a mother bear and her cubs foraging for berries, a fox darting through the snow. Each photograph told a story, a reminder of the interconnectedness of all living things. Latricia, inspired by her father's transformation, began to join him on his excursions. Together they would sit in silence, watching and waiting. These moments, precious and fleeting, became the foundation of a new bond between them, a shared reverence for the natural world that had given Mr. Thomas a new lease on life. As the years passed, Mr. Thomas's health inevitably declined, but his spirit remained undimmed. He'd found a purpose that not only enriched his remaining years, but also left a lasting legacy of conservation and appreciation for nature. On a crisp autumn day, the kind where the air is filled with the scent of turning leaves and the promise of the winter's chill, Mr. Thomas sat quietly on the porch of his house. The screen door, a barrier to some but merely a suggestion to the more determined visitors of the forest, gently swayed in the light breeze. It was a day like any other, peaceful and unassuming, until it became a day Mr. Thomas and his family would never forget. As Mr. Thomas enjoyed the serenity of his surroundings, a sight appeared before him that took his breath away. A magnificent 10-point buck, its antlers a sign of its age and wisdom, stood just beyond the porch. For a moment, time seemed to stand still as the two beings locked eyes. Then, with an almost imperceptible nod, the deer approached the screen door, nudging the handle with its nose and astonishingly managing to open it. Mr. Thomas remained still, a silent observer to the wonder unfolding before him. The deer, displaying an uncharacteristic trust, stepped closer, allowing Mr. Thomas to reach out and touch it. The connection between man and beast was immediate and profound, as if the deer sensed Mr. Thomas's deep respect for the natural world. "What are you doing here, my friend?" Mr. Thomas whispered, his voice laced with awe. "You hungry? Just come to say hello?" The deer, unable to respond in words, continued to nuzzle Mr. Thomas's hand, its action speaking volumes about the bond they shared in that moment. Inside the house, Latricia and her siblings Tom and Linda watched in disbelief. Their father, once a proud hunter, was now engaging with a wild deer as one might with a beloved pet. "Can you believe this?" Tom murmured, his voice a mix of shock and wonder. "It's like the deer knows Dad, knows who he is and what he's become," Linda added, her eyes wide with amazement. Latricia, tears brimming in her eyes, nodded. "It's a sign, I think. A sign that Dad's choice to respect life, to capture its beauty rather than take it, was the right one." After some time, Mr. Thomas gently withdrew his hand, and with a respectful nod to the deer, he made his way back inside. The animal, having shared this moment of connection, eventually wandered off, leaving behind a family touched by the encounter. Latricia and her siblings rushed outside, hoping for a chance to experience what their father had, but the deer, perhaps sensing its role had been fulfilled, had moved on. The siblings returned inside, finding their father reflective and at peace. "Dad, that was incredible," Latricia said, struggling to find the words. "How did you feel touching a wild deer like that?" Mr. Thomas smiled, a look of serene acceptance in his eyes. "It felt like a blessing, like a final affirmation of the choices I've made. I've lived a life full of adventure, taken paths less traveled, and in the end found peace in the beauty of existence. Today, that magnificent creature reminded me of the preciousness of life, of the respect we owe to all living things." Tom, moved by his father's words, added, "It's like the deer knew you, Dad, knew that you've changed and wanted to show its respect." "And to think," Linda said, "once upon a time you might have hunted that deer, but today you shared a moment of peace with it." Mr. Thomas nodded, his gaze drifting to the window where the deer had stood. "Life is full of surprises, of moments that challenge us to see the world differently. I'm grateful for every second, for the journey from hunter to guardian of nature's beauty. It's been my greatest honor." As the conversation waned, Mr. Thomas looked at each of his children, a sense of finality in his expression. "I'm ready," he said softly, his voice imbued with a profound acceptance. "Ready to embrace whatever comes next with the same peace and gratitude I felt today." Latricia, Tom, and Linda understood the weight of their father's words. They gathered around him, their hands intertwined, forming a circle of strength and love. "We're here for you, Dad," Latricia said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "Always." Mr. Thomas smiled, his heart full. "I know, my dears, and I'm so grateful for that. Remember, always look for the beauty in the world. It's there in the most unexpected places waiting to be discovered." In the quiet, softly lit room, the atmosphere was thick with a mixture of love and impending sorrow. Mr. Thomas lay in his bed, a figure of tranquility amidst a storm of emotions surrounding him. Latricia, Tom, Linda, and Nancy, his longtime companion, gathered around him, each holding a part of him as if to anchor him to this world a little longer. The air was filled with the unspoken, the words that didn't need to be said aloud, communicated through the warmth of their touch and the shared glances that passed between them. "Dad, we're all here with you," Latricia whispered, her voice trembling with the effort to remain strong. Mr. Thomas opened his eyes, a faint smile playing on his lips. "I know, sweetheart. I feel so loved. Thank you." Nancy squeezed his hand gently, her eyes brimming with tears. "You've given us all so much, more than you could ever know. We love you." Tom and Linda nodded in agreement, their faces an illustration to the impact Mr. Thomas had on their lives. "You've been the best father anyone could ask for," Tom said. "And you've shown us the beauty of the world in ways we never imagined," Linda added, trying to smile through her tears. Mr. Thomas looked at each of them, his gaze lingering as if memorizing their faces for the last time. "I'm so grateful for all of it, for you. Remember to keep finding the beauty in everything." As the room fell into a heavy silence, Mr. Thomas drew a slow, labored breath, his grip on their hands gently loosening. And just like that, amidst the love of his family, he quietly passed away, his face serene as if he'd simply fallen into a deep, peaceful sleep. The moment he was gone, a palpable shift occurred. the room suddenly feeling emptier, the silence more profound. Tears flowed freely as Latricia, Tom, Linda, and Nancy clung to each other, united in their grief. It wasn't long after that the hospice nurse, a kind-faced woman named Marianne, arrived. She moved with a gentle efficiency, her presence a small comfort in the wake of their loss. Latricia, seeking some solace, pulled Marianne aside. "He had this moment just 2 days ago with a deer right here outside our house." She showed Marianne the picture of her father petting the deer, a moment captured that now felt like a parting gift. Marianne looked at the photo, her expression softening. "That's beautiful. It's like he made a new friend right at the end." Latricia nodded, a fresh wave of tears spilling over. "When you came in, did you see?" "I did," Marianne replied, her voice gentle. "That same deer, I believe. It was circling the house as I arrived, almost as if it knew, as if it came to say goodbye." Hearing this, Latricia felt a bittersweet comfort wash over her. It was as if the natural world so cherished by her father was acknowledging his passing, paying its respect in the only way it could. The thought of the deer, a symbol of her father's changed perspective of life, coming back one last time was both heartbreaking and incredibly touching. Latricia shared this with her siblings and Nancy, and while it did little to ease the sharpness of their grief, it brought them a sense of wonder and connection to their father's final days. "He was so loved, not just by us, but by the world he loved so much," Latricia said, looking back at the picture. Nancy wrapped an arm around her. "He had a way of touching hearts, of seeing the beauty in everything. That deer is like a sign he's at peace, that he's still with us in a way." Tom and Linda agreed, finding a small measure of peace in the thought. "Dad's legacy isn't just in us, it's in every life he touched, every moment of beauty he captured," Tom said. "And in every deer in the woods, every sunrise he photographed," Linda added, a smile through her tears. As they stood together, looking out at the spot where Mr. Thomas and the deer had shared their moment, they felt a connection to him, to the natural world he loved so dearly, and to each other. In their hearts, they knew that while he had passed from this world, the lessons he taught them, the love he gave, and the beauty he showed them would live on forever. In that moment of profound sadness and reflection, they understood that Mr. Thomas was ready, that he had made peace with his fate, and somehow, through their tears and the shared memories, they began to find their own peace with his passing, holding on to the love and the beauty he'd left behind. If heartwarming stories are what you like to hear about, then subscribe to our channel for much more.